The applause was still echoing across the stadium when my best friend stepped in front of me and quietly ruined my entire world. "Emily," he said, his voice shaking, "your mother paid me to stay away from you." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. I was still wearing my graduation gown. My name had just been called. Thousands of people were standing, cheering, celebrating the moment that was supposed to define my future. I should have been smiling. Instead, my chest tightened as I looked past him and saw my mother a few rows away, clapping proudly, tears in her eyes, like she'd just won something she'd been planning for years. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, forcing a laugh, so no one would notice. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "She's been paying me since high school," he said. "Every time you needed me most." And just like that, my graduation stopped feeling like an ending and started feeling like the moment I finally learned the truth about my own life. My name is Emily Carter, and for as long as I can remember, I had been trained to perform success. Not to feel it, not to question it, just to perform it. Perfect grades, perfect manners, perfect future. My mother loved to say she was preparing me for the real world. What she actually meant was preparing me for her world. "Friends are temporary," she'd tell me whenever someone drifted away. "Distractions," she'd say with a tight smile. "Focus on what matters." And what mattered, according to her, was achievement, image, control. By the time I reached high school, my life looked impressive on paper. Honors classes, extracurriculars chosen strategically, not joyfully. Summer programs selected because they looked right, not because I wanted them. Jake was the one person who didn't fit into that plan. We'd been inseparable since middle school, late-night calls, shared notes, inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else. When my anxiety spiked before exams, he was the one who talked me down. When I felt invisible at home, he reminded me I wasn't. Until he didn't. The change was sudden. After junior year, he started pulling away. Texts went unanswered. Plans were canceled. When I finally confronted him, he just said he was busy and needed space. I believed him because the alternative hurt too much. My mother noticed, of course. She always noticed when something slipped out of her control. "That boy was holding you back," she said casually one night at dinner. "You seem more focused now." I didn't feel more focused. I felt hollow. College came, and the pattern continued. I made acquaintances, not friends. People came close, then somehow drifted away. I told myself it was normal. Everyone was busy. Everyone grew apart. But there were moments, late at night, staring at my phone, when the loneliness felt too precise to be accidental. I blamed myself. I told myself I was difficult, too intense, too quiet, too much or not enough. Jake became a ghost in my life. Someone I missed but never questioned too deeply, because questioning meant reopening wounds I didn't think would ever heal. Standing there in my graduation gown, listening to him confess the truth, every one of those memories came rushing back with a clarity that made my hands shake. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't timing. It wasn't me. And as the cheering crowd continued celebrating behind us, I realized something terrifying. The life I thought I'd earned had been carefully curated, and I was just beginning to understand the cost. We stood behind the stadium, half hidden by a row of tall banners flapping in the wind. The noise of celebration faded into a dull roar, like I was underwater. Jake rubbed his palms together, a nervous habit I remembered from when we were kids, back when problems were small and honesty came easily. "She came to me the summer before senior year," he said finally, "right after you got that early acceptance letter." My throat tightened. "My mother?" He nodded. "She asked me to meet her for coffee. Said she wanted to thank me for being such a good influence." That already sounded wrong. "She didn't smile much," he went on. "She talked about your future like it was a project. Said you were destined for bigger things than people from backgrounds like mine." I felt a sharp sting of anger, but I forced myself to stay quiet. "She told me you didn't need emotional attachments," Jake said. "That friendships like ours would distract you from becoming who you were meant to be." "And the money?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. $5,000. Cash. She slid the envelope across the table like it was nothing. My stomach turned. "For what?" "For distance," he said. "She said I didn't have to disappear completely, just slowly fade out. Miss calls. Stop showing up. Let you move on without drama." I remembered that summer vividly. How Jake had canceled plans at the last minute. How he'd stopped answering my late-night messages. How I cried in my room, convinced I'd done something wrong. "You could have told me," I said, my voice barely steady. "I wanted to," he said quickly. "I tried. But then she changed tactics." He looked up at me then, eyes red. "She asked about my parents. About my dad's job. About the company that paid our health insurance." A chill ran through me. "She said it would be a shame if certain conversations reached the wrong people," he continued. "She never yelled. Never threatened directly. She just implied. I thought of my mother's calm voice, her careful words, the way she never raised her tone because she never needed to. So you took the money, I said. Jake nodded once. I told myself it was temporary, that once college started, everything would reset. But it didn't. He told me about the second payment, $10,000 after our first year of college. How my mother had framed it as a continuation of the agreement. She said you were thriving, he said bitterly. That I'd done the right thing by stepping aside. I clenched my hands into fists. All those times I told myself I was independent now. That loneliness was just part of growing up. It hadn't been growth. It had been design. And the worst part? Jake said quietly. She made it sound like she was doing this for you. Like I was the problem she was fixing. I looked back toward the stadium, where my mother was still laughing with other parents, glowing with pride. In that moment, I understood something I'd never allowed myself to see before. My isolation wasn't accidental. It had been purchased. And suddenly, every achievement I'd been so proud of felt heavier, because I couldn't stop wondering how many of them had required me to be alone. Jake hesitated, like he was deciding how much truth I could handle at once. There wasn't just one payment, he said finally. Or two. My heart sank. I already knew what was coming, but hearing it out loud still felt like another door slamming shut. After sophomore year, he continued, she reached out again. This time, she didn't pretend it was about helping you focus. She said things were working, that you were becoming exactly who she wanted you to be. I laughed softly, the sound thin and unfamiliar. And she wanted to make sure it stayed that way. He nodded. Another 10,000. She called it maintenance. That word hit me harder than the amount. Maintenance. Like I was a system that needed constant adjustment. Like my relationships were loose screws she could tighten whenever she felt control slipping. She started being more specific, Jake said. She asked if you'd mentioned feeling lonely. If you ever asked about me. If you seemed unhappy. My chest tightened. You reported back to her? No, he said quickly. Never. I refused. And that's when the pressure increased. He told me how she'd remind him, calmly and politely, that she still knew where his parents lived, where his dad worked, which loans his family depended on. She never said the word threat, Jake said. She didn't have to. She just smiled and said she'd hate for misunderstandings to affect innocent people. I closed my eyes. I thought of every time my mother had asked, how's Jake doing these days? The casual tone. The fake concern. She paid me again last year, Jake went on. 20,000. Right after you started dating Mark. I flinched at the name. My almost boyfriend. The one who'd suddenly pulled away, without explanation. She said romantic attachments were especially dangerous, Jake said. That you were at a critical stage. That losing people now would make you stronger. Stronger. I'd spent that year barely sleeping, questioning every conversation, wondering why people always seemed to leave once they got close. You know what I hate the most? Jake said, his voice breaking. She made me believe I was disposable, that I was just an obstacle in the way of your real life. I looked at him, then really looked at him, and saw the weight he'd been carrying alone. I hated myself for taking the money, he said. But I hated myself even more for staying silent. The noise from the stadium drifted toward us again. Laughter, photos, celebration. I was supposed to be proud, accomplished, complete. Instead, I felt like I was standing in the ruins of a carefully constructed lie. Every gap in my life suddenly made sense. Every unanswered message. Every friendship that faded without a fight. It wasn't that people didn't choose me. They were being paid not to. And as that truth settled in, something inside me shifted. The confusion I'd lived with for years was gone. In its place was anger, quiet, focused, and impossible to ignore. Because if my mother had been willing to buy my silence, my loneliness, my emotional world, then this wasn't about love. It was about control. And for the first time in my life, I knew I couldn't keep pretending otherwise. I didn't confront my mother that day. Not immediately. I smiled for photos. I hugged relatives. I accepted congratulations like a well-trained performer finishing the final act of a long play. But every word Jake had said replayed in my head, over and over, until I could barely hear anything else. That night, after the house finally quieted, I found my mother in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. She looked relaxed, victorious. I stood across from her, my graduation gown still folded over my arm. Did you pay Jake to stay away from me? I asked. She didn't spill the wine. She didn't gasp. She didn't even look surprised. She set the glass down slowly and studied me like I'd just asked something mildly inconvenient. Yes, she said. I did. The calmness of her voice hurt more than if she'd shouted. Why? I asked. Why would you do that to me? She sighed. Emily, you were too attached. Too emotional. He wasn't part of the future you needed. You threatened his family, I said, my hands shaking now. You used money and fear to control him. Her expression tightened, not with guilt, but with annoyance. I protected you, she replied. You don't understand how the world works yet. People like Jake would have held you back. Held me back. From what? From being lonely? From questioning her authority? I spent years thinking something was wrong with me, I said. Thinking I wasn't worth staying for. She waved a hand dismissively. That discomfort made you stronger. Something inside my chest cracked open. You didn't make me strong, I said quietly. You made me isolated. Her eyes hardened. Everything you have is because of me. And that was when I understood the truth I'd been avoiding my entire life. She didn't see my pain as damage. She saw it as collateral. I walked out of the kitchen without raising my voice, but my legs felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath me had shifted. Because that conversation wasn't just an argument. It was confirmation. My mother hadn't lost control by accident. She had chosen it, deliberately, carefully, and without remorse. And in that moment, standing alone in the hallway of the house she controlled, I realized this was no longer about the past. This was about what I was going to do next. The next morning, I didn't argue with my mother again. I called a lawyer, saying the words out loud. I think my mother manipulated my relationships using money and threats, made my hands shake. I kept expecting someone to tell me I was overreacting, that this was a family matter, that I should let it go. Instead, the lawyer asked calm, precise questions. Do you have proof? Did the payments occur over time? Were there implied consequences if he refused? Jake agreed to help. He forwarded old messages, bank records, dates, amounts. Even a short email my mother had sent years ago, carefully worded, polite, but unmistakably transactional. Reading it with a professional beside me was surreal. What I had lived through as confusion and heartbreak had names now. Coercive control, financial leverage, intentional isolation. When the formal letter went out, my mother called within hours. Her voice was tight, controlled. You're making a mistake, she said. This will embarrass the family. I'm not doing this to embarrass anyone, I replied. I'm doing it to protect myself. You wouldn't survive without me, she said flatly. You've never handled the real world on your own. For years, that sentence would have crushed me. This time it didn't. Because I finally understood something she never expected me to learn. Power only works when you're afraid to question it. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid anymore. I hung up the phone, my heart racing, but clear. The fear was still there. So was the grief. But standing beside the law, with facts instead of apologies, I felt something new rising underneath it all. Resolve. Because no matter how carefully she had controlled my past, she no longer had the right to decide my future. My mother didn't wait long to prove she meant every word. Within days, my credit card stopped working. My access to shared accounts disappeared. Family members started calling, not to ask if I was okay, but to tell me I was being dramatic and that my mother was heartbroken. I moved into a small studio apartment near campus, paid for with savings I'd quietly built from tutoring and part-time work, money she hadn't known about. The place was barely furnished. A mattress on the floor, a folding table, one chair. It felt terrifying. And honest. For the first time, every decision was mine. Every bill, every mistake, every small victory. Jake checked in often, careful not to push, just present in a way he hadn't been allowed to be for years. We talked about boundaries, about guilt, about how control can convince good people they're powerless. I started applying for jobs without using my mother's name. The rejections came quickly and often. Each one stung, but each one also taught me something she never had. Failure wasn't a catastrophe. It was information. One evening, after a long shift and another rejection email, I sat on the floor of my apartment and cried, not because I wanted to go back, but because I finally understood how much growing up I'd been denied. My mother had always said she was protecting me from struggle. The truth was simpler and crueler. She was protecting herself from losing control. And as hard as it was to stand alone, I knew this fragile independence, earned, imperfect, and real, was worth more than any comfort she could offer in exchange for my silence. The pressure didn't stop. It only changed shape. My mother stopped calling and started communicating through other people, aunts, family friends, even former teachers who suddenly felt the need to check in. Every message carried the same subtext. Come back. Apologize. Let this go. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside was a letter from her attorney. It wasn't a threat, exactly. It was worse. Carefully phrased warnings about family reputation, future opportunities, and how continuing this course could unnecessarily complicate my life. I sat on the floor with that letter in my hands for a long time. This was the moment she was counting on. The moment when fear would outweigh truth. When exhaustion would make me surrender. When I'd decide peace was worth more than justice. I called my lawyer instead. We went through everything again, slowly, carefully. What the process would look like. How long it could take. What I might lose socially, financially, emotionally. Are you sure? She asked me gently. Once you move forward, there's no pretending this never happened. I thought about the girl I'd been, apologizing for other people leaving. Shrinking myself so I wouldn't be too much. Believing love meant obedience. Then I thought about standing behind that stadium, in my graduation gown, realizing my loneliness had been purchased without my consent. Yes, I said. I'm sure. When I hung up, my hands were steady. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to my mother's power. I was choosing my own. And whatever came next, I knew this decision, this refusal to be quietly controlled, was the turning point my life had been waiting for. The legal process didn't fix everything overnight. It didn't erase the years of doubt or magically replace the relationships I'd lost. Healing wasn't a single moment. It was slow, uneven, and sometimes painfully quiet. But something important did change. I stopped confusing control with care. As the weeks passed, I built a life piece by piece. I found steady work, not impressive on paper, but honest. I learned how to budget, how to ask for help without shame, how to say no without explaining myself. Each small decision felt like a muscle I was using for the first time. Jake and I talked often. Not about the past, but about accountability. About how fear can trap people on both sides of manipulation. We didn't rush forgiveness. We let trust rebuild at its own pace. My mother eventually stopped trying to pull me back, at least directly. The law had drawn boundaries she couldn't cross without consequences. And while she never truly apologized, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't punishment. It was distance. And distance, I learned, can be a form of safety. Looking back, I understand now that abuse doesn't always look like shouting or visible harm. Sometimes it wears a calm voice. A polished smile. A justification that sounds reasonable if you don't look too closely. Sometimes it says, I know what's best for you. What I wish someone had told me sooner is this. Love does not isolate you. Protection does not require fear. And guidance does not come with threats, spoken or implied. If someone controls your relationships, your finances, or your sense of self for your own good, that isn't care. That's ownership. Graduation day was supposed to celebrate everything I'd achieved. Instead, it marked the moment I finally saw the truth. Not about my mother, not about Jake, but about myself. I wasn't weak for needing people. I wasn't flawed for wanting connection. And I wasn't wrong for questioning the life that had been chosen for me. Walking away cost me comfort. Standing up cost me security. But choosing myself gave me something far more valuable. Freedom built on honesty. Relationships based on consent. And a future shaped by my own voice. The applause eventually faded. The cap and gown went into storage. But the lesson stayed with me, clear, permanent, and earned. Your life is not a project for someone else to manage. It is a responsibility you have the right to claim. And that, more than any diploma, was the education that truly changed my life.